So now, with the high voltage cover removed, we are ready to begin powering this unit on and checking the power supply voltages. As I said before, the power regulation, the voltage regulation won't fully kick in until it has plugins inside of it. So at the moment we're just doing a very basic check to make sure that that there is power on all of the rails and that nothing is at too high of a voltage that might damage the plugins when they get put in. So we are going to begin by checking the low voltage supply with our multimeter. We're going to have it in the volt setting, of course, and there are 4 power supply rails in the low voltage section. They are a positive 100 volt rail, a negative 100 volt rail, a positive 248 volt rail, and a negative 12.6 volt rail. So we're going to begin by powering the unit on. Then normally we would give it some time to warm up before we check the power supply voltages, but I generally found that the low voltage power supplies in these generally don't tend to vary much with temperature, and also I know this unit works, so I'm just going to quickly check through it. The easiest way to check it is to just measure between case ground and whatever you want to measure. The positive 100 volts can be most easily measured from these red and white wires here. So you just touch the multimeter here. I'm reading 99.3 volts. Again, the regulation will vary a little bit once the plugins are in, so that seems fine. Next, you are going to measure the negative 100 volt rail, which is this fuse right here, and that measures negative 99.8 volts, so that's just fine even without the plugins in it. And you want to measure both sides of the fuse, because if it has a blown fuse, then it's going to measure the correct voltage on one side but not the other. Then you're going to check the positive 248 volt rail. That measures 247.4 volts on my multimeter, so that's fine as well. And lastly, the 12.6 volt rail, which is measuring 12.68, which again, all that seems fine. So now we want to check the high voltage rail. And for that we're going to need the high voltage probe. So now, with our high voltage probe plugged into our multimeter here, we are going to notice that the high voltage probe has 2 parts. It has your ground clip here and the tip here, which we will be measuring the high voltage from. So the clip can just connect to anywhere on the case ground. I prefer to connect it right there. And then the high voltage section that we want to measure, the high voltage rail is negative 2,350 volts, and it can be measured off of this green wire right here. So you're going to touch it to the connection on the board right there. And I know for a fact that this probe measures a little bit low, about 2% low. So I sort of correct for that afterwards. But I am actually reading this to be a little bit high. Now, this high voltage is only for driving the CRT. It doesn't actually affect the plugins, so we can continue with this if we want, but I am actually going to just tweak it down a little bit. The high voltage adjustment potentiometer is this one right here. You can't really see it because of the cover, but let me actually remove the camera and show you here. So it's going to be this potentiometer right here. That is your high voltage adjustment potentiometer. And so we are just going to reconnect our high voltage ground clip, being extremely careful while doing this because these are extremely high voltages. It goes without saying. And once again, a small flathead insulated screwdriver. reaching down there, being careful not to short it against that piece of the case right there, and turning it just a little bit counterclockwise brings it down into a range where I feel comfortable. And so I will disconnect that, and so with all the power rails confirmed to be roughly in their correct ranges, we can now try and power this thing up with the plugins connected. So now I've turned the unit off. We do not want to be inserting the plugins into a powered unit. I don't think it was meant for that. And we're going to slide the plugins back in. Now remember, we have the unit upside down right now, so we're going to need to put the plugins in also upside down. So these will just slide in, and just very carefully push it in, getting it to line up with the connections in the back. These things always really crunch when you put them in. It's just the way they are. And then that little handle should just pop right in. So now with the plugins in it, we can try powering it on again. And one thing I should note about these plugins, and honestly it's a little bit baffling, I don't know why it happens, is sometimes for seemingly no reason at all, the two fuses on the back of the IF unit like to pop. And this just happens once in a while. Every, maybe, I don't know, 1 in 10 or 15 times that I power it on, it will pop the fuses. When this was something that was told to me by a mentor of mine, I honestly didn't believe it when he told me that. I figured he probably just had something wrong with his unit, but then it happened to me. So yes, this is a thing that can happen. As far as I know, it's not clear why. I guess just power supply rails powering up at slightly different rates and creating a combination that blows the fuses. But I'm hoping that won't happen here. In which case you probably won't see this video, but so we're just going to power it on. And so we are getting lights to the IF unit. And let's see here. And we have a trace on the screen. You can see that actually almost better than I can. So now we're going to go back and check the power supply rails again. And so we are going to get our multimeter back out here, put the normal probes back in, and once again we are going to be measuring between the case ground and the power supply rails. Generally speaking, we're going to be measuring on top of the fuses. So from power supply ground to the red and white wires here, these are going to be positive 100 volts plus or minus 1 volt. So I'm going to measure that there. It's measuring, again, still 99.3 volts. So I'm actually going to, while I'm here, going to tweak that up a little bit. The adjustment potentiometer for the positive 100 volt rail is this potentiometer right here, the middle of this set of 3. And so I am going to, actually what I'm going to do is I'm going to put the negative probe just in this hole here. That's something I like to do. Just so I don't have to hold it, and then I'm going to touch the probe here, being careful not to short anything out. And then while I'm doing that, I'm going to bring in my screwdriver here. And normally I'd be standing where the camera is, but obviously the camera's there, so I can't do that. And I'm going to just very, very gently tweak it up, so now 99.9. 100. And so that looks good. And a thing to note about these power supplies is that there is an order that you need to check them in. That it's a series regulated power supply, so each section of each rail of the low voltage section is referenced to the other rails on the power supply. So the positive 100 volt rail is your sort of master reference rail, that all the other power supply voltages are interrelated to that positive 100 volt rail. So if you measure the voltage on this and all of the voltage seem to be out, then there's a very good chance that the problem is going to be with your positive 100 volt rail. And so next we're going to measure the negative 100 volt rail, this one here. So now that's reading negative 100.5. Again, it's negative 100.5 plus or minus 1 volt, so that's technically in spec, but I will adjust it. It's this potentiometer right here, the one farthest from you, and I'm just going to very lightly turn it down, 100.1, and negative 100 on the dot. And the next one we will measure is the positive 248 volts. And you can't actually measure the positive 100 volt rail from this fuse. It is the for that rail, but it's actually before the regulator. I don't know why all these other fuses are after the regulator, and this one is before, but that's why it is. So actually, if you try and measure this one, it'll measure about 140 to 150 volts, just the unregulated linear supply before the large regulator transistors back here. And so the positive 248 volt rail, again, measuring a little bit high, about 249.2 volts. And so if we actually go to the manual, we can see that the specs are listed here. It is, so as I said before, positive 100 volts plus or minus 1 volt, minus 100 volts plus or minus 1 volt, positive 248 volts plus or minus 2.5 volts, and negative 12.6 volts plus or minus 0.13 volts. And so going back to the power supply, it's measuring 249.2. Again, that's well within the spec, but I'm just going to tweak it down. It is this one here, the one closest to you. And very gently, 248 volts. So that's good. And lastly, the 12.6, which is again measuring a little high, about 12.7. Remember, doing this in the correct order is important. If you set the 12.6 volt rail and then change the 100 volt rail, then suddenly all the other power supply rails will have changed as well. So you do need to do them in the order that I'm doing them. And so the 12.6 volt adjustment potentiometer is this one right here, the closest one on this set of two. The one on this one is just for the 10 volt calibrator on the front. That's really only relevant for the oscilloscope plugins, not the spectrum analyzer plugins. So honestly, I just don't even bother with that one. But the 12.6 volt one, I'm just going to lower just a tiny little bit to 12.6, just a little bit finicky here. So 12.59, that's pretty darn close. So now we are going to pull out the high voltage probe again, and I'm going to double check the high voltage section. As I said, the high voltage section is really only used to drive the CRT, so I imagine that putting the plugins in won't have affected it very much, but the fact that there's actually a trace on the screen now will make a difference. So I will grab my high voltage probe again, set it to the volt setting, and I will connect the ground lead here. I will hold it behind the insulator here. Make sure I have maximum safety between me and that extremely high voltage. And it's measuring a little bit low, probably because I lowered the 12.6 volt rail a little bit. So I'm actually going to just tweak that up just a little bit. The power supply voltage specification for the positive or the negative 2,350 volt rail is plus or minus 25 volts. So it's actually plus or minus 1%, about the same as all the others. So I'm actually going to turn that up just a tiny little bit. And that should do it. And so now we are going to begin calibrating the actual display itself, now that we have the power supply in the correct range.